Welcome everyone to the Ontario Caregiver Organization's webinar series. These webinars bring together caregivers and subject matter experts to explore topics of interest to caregivers. We do this to support and engage chosen family, friends, and neighbors, really anyone who's caring for someone else. My name is Katie Muirhead, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. We begin this gathering by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. And while we meet in a virtual platform with people joining us from across the province, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. The land that I'm standing on is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. And this territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendships of Indigenous peoples. As team members at OCO, we are learning about the lands from which we work and exploring how we can be meaningful allies and how we can support the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We invite you to take a moment to reflect on the land where you are. And if you're not familiar with that, we will be sharing an interactive map that tells you which traditional territory your city or town sits on. And you can find that at native-land.ca in the chat box. Our webinar today is called Caregiver Mental Health, How to Reduce Anxiety for Better Living. The caregiving role can bring forward many different feelings and emotions, and anxiety is one which can be problematic for those managing care. And today we welcome back Dr. Patrick McGrath to talk about anxiety in caregivers, how to notice and address it, and practical and unique tips to support your mental health. Dr. McGrath is a clinical psychologist and emeritus professor of psychiatry at Dalhousie University and a scientist at the IWK Health Center, where his research is based. He's an adjunct professor of psychiatry at the University of Ottawa and founder and president of the 90-Second Health Letters, and he frequently treats caregivers with anxiety in his private practice. So I want to welcome back Dr. McGrath.
So thank you very much. I really enjoy speaking with the Ontario Caregivers Organization. So today I'm going to try and move my slide. Yes, we're going to talk about anxiety in caregivers. And as you say, that's my picture. And I want to talk mostly on what is anxiety, why caregivers do have anxiety, preventing anxiety, and managing anxiety. So anxiety is a signal of danger or threat. It means that we perceive that there's some risk out there for us. Actually, anxiety is a good thing because it keeps us safe. So, take example of somebody who says, well, maybe I better not walk in that sketchy area of town at 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, that keeps you safe. But it was designed, it was built into our DNA when we all lived in caves and long, long ago. And in that time, there were, real different types of things that were dangers or threats to us than there are now. What happens is when we perceive danger, when we get anxious, we go into a fight, a flight, or a freeze mode. And it's quite useful for physical emergencies. The mother who lifts a car off their child because she has a surge of anxiety and because her child is underneath a car or a tree and she's able to do that. But it's not helpful in high levels for complex situations where physical strength or running away or fighting is not the best solution. So anxiety is from our genetics. So some people have a proclivity because of their genes. They've inherited it from their parents. sometimes from experience, especially trauma. Modeling, if your parents were anxious or you've been surrounded by people who are anxious, then that's going to increase your anxiety and long-term stress. But anxiety is also due to the situation that we're in, and complex, difficult, stressful situations without enough support are likely to lead to anxiety. So anxiety consists of how our body reacts, what we do, what we feel, and what we think. These are the components of anxiety, and this begins to give us a clue of how we might intervene with anxiety. So our body reacts, as I mentioned, there is this natural response to fight or flight, and it's mostly through what we call the sympathetic nervous system. And it is sort of a contradiction. It's not very sympathetic to us, but it's called the sympathetic nervous system. And our heart rate is increased, sometimes irregular heart rate. We tend to breathe less deeply, may get muscle tension or even tremor. Our gut motility, how our guts work, how our bowels work may change. So you may get pain in your stomach and your gut, or in extreme cases, you may get bowel movements from absolute terror. You get chills or sweating or dizziness. Those are all very common reflections of the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. And what we do, we can either avoid, we can escape. And avoidance and escape are the things that are really often occur in anxiety, but often aren't very useful in overcoming anxiety. And indecision often occurs during that situation as well. So we may begin to can't make a decision, don't know what to do, can't seem to control what we're thinking. And what we feel, we may feel fear, we may be worried or helpless, or even hopeless. And on the other side of it, we may have anger, or we may be depressed. All of these are normal responses to anxiety. And what we think is also important. We may be very confused, or we may be catastrophizing, thinking all sorts of terrible things will happen, always looking at the very negative things that are going to happen. We may blame, or we may become more impulsive as we're thinking and moving from one thing to another thing, to another thing, to another thing. Those are all natural responses when we are anxious. Now, in terms of why are caregivers vulnerable to anxiety? Well, the problem is that caregiving is very demanding. Families are very stressed. Sleep is often very disrupted, either because of the activity of the person being cared for or because of worry. There's an awful lot of work involved. Oftentimes people will be trying to balance two jobs, the job of caregiving and their job with the rest of their family, and maybe a third job where they're having a job that outside the house. There's so many responsibilities. And then there is the issue of grieving oftentimes before, grieving the loss of function in the caregiver. Sometimes it's really hard to see decline in the person being cared for. So the other side of the nervous system is called the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the calm, quiet, easygoing part of our nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system comes on very fast and comes off slowly. This parasympathetic nervous system is slower to react. It's slow to come on, and it can be stopped by the sympathetic nervous system, but it tends to endure as well. So again, how our body reacts, what we do, what we feel, and what we think are all important for the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. So small changes in what we think and what we do and our physiology are really important. Small changes and cumulative changes. So much like interest rates, or not interest rates, but interest on your savings, the cumulative benefit is the key. If you make 1% change in your behavior or your physiological response daily for 3 months, you're going to get a 245% improvement. So I always advocate for small, gentle changes in what we do rather than trying to turn around things all at once. It's a lot, we all want to make things better all at once, but it's often more enduring. We can also figure out whether we're going in the right direction if we make small changes. We have to change not only what we are, but also change the environment, because the environment does change the way we respond. So if we can reduce chaos, if we can figure out what our own values are, and then try and align everything that we do with our values, rather than going off in all directions, trying to be everything to everyone, we have to start thinking about, well, what's important? What's important to me? How can I align what I do and what I think and my reactions to my values? That'll decrease the stress. And of course, increasing social support is another way of changing the environment. So in terms of changing the environment, this aligning with your values, I think, is really, really important. That differs from person to person. But some of the common things with caregivers is that we have to be able to ask and accept help. And sometimes that's not very easy for us because we have a mistaken belief that nobody will help, or that we have to do it all on our own, or maybe we don't really know how to ask people in a way that's helpful. We should be looking to simplify what we do. Oftentimes our plans and what we do becomes more complex than is really needed. And simplification is often very helpful. So making simple meals, trying to get the house clean enough, not perfectly clean, and really trying to get more efficiencies in what we're doing and more support. But caregiver anxiety is a individual issue too, because of our own behavior, our own physiology, and our own thinking. And oftentimes the individual change combined with trying to get some external changes, either in the situation of the person cared for, or in our social support, or our support for caring for a person, or even sometimes the layout of the house and the types of things that we have around the house. All of those things can be very helpful, but together, an individual approach and a more general approach is often very helpful. So in some ways, changing what we do is the most direct way to change anxiety. And if we increase positive activity, very often caregivers feel that they have so many things to do, they don't have time for doing any of the things that give them joy. And so it's really important to start trying to find small things, to change what we do in terms of increasing positive activity. That might be as simple as taking the time to look out your window and notice the bird feeder, or put up a bird feeder if you like that sort of thing, or have a few plants in the garden, maybe not a big garden, but just a little garden that you can enjoy. I know I get a lot of joy from watching my tomatoes grow right now they're seedlings. And that's just, so I spend a minute or two looking at my tomato plants and my cucumbers and peppers and eggplant and just enjoying that. Simple time to take away from all the things that are demands on us. The second thing is that we should think about confronting our anxiety. It's typical when we have anxiety that we like to avoid what's causing the anxiety. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to face it. We just want to get away from it because it's very unpleasant. But confronting the anxiety is really, really very helpful. That doesn't mean that we have to confront it all at once, but if we're afraid of a specific thing, if we're afraid of the person that we're caring for is going to die, then you have to recognize that. That's what I'm afraid of. And when you confront it, it's not nearly as difficult as if you try to avoid it. So reducing avoidance. And what I always tell my patients is that if you're afraid of it, that means you should be doing it. Now, that's kind of silly in some instances. I wouldn't want to parachute because I'm afraid of jumping out of planes, and I don't advise that you go and do it. But in the small things like raising issues that are difficult, well, that's the thing that if you're afraid of raising issues that are difficult, then you're going to have to do it. Now, you should think about it, you should plan it, but don't avoid things. The other thing is keeping connected to your family, if they're supportive, to your friends, to other caregivers. Those are very effective ways of reducing anxiety. So changing what we do in other ways. So improving our diet is a good way to overcome anxiety. Eating well is really helpful. Reducing alcohol and drug, especially cannabis is often used, but other drug use. So the alcohol is an interesting one because alcohol has an immediate effect of reducing anxiety, but the long-term effect is increasing anxiety. So it might make you feel good for a few minutes or maybe even half an hour, but then it starts to increase your anxiety. Improving your sleep. Sleep is a magic elixir, and oftentimes it's hard for people who are caregivers to get enough sleep. But what we really strongly suggest is that people practice what we call good sleep hygiene. So that means that you have a room that's quiet, that's dark, that's cool enough, but not too cold, not too warm, and that you don't use screens. The telephone or your television or any of those things are signals to your brain that it's time to be awake. So it's a good idea to reduce screen use for at least an hour before bedtime. And setting routines. You should have a specific time to go to bed and a specific time to get up rather than just changing it all the time. So a routine of bedtime and also a routine of what you do before you go to bed. So a slow down time where you try and slow down your body. And of course, generally reducing our social media use. Social media is good for some things, like it's good to be able to keep in touch with family and friends. That's a very valuable way to use social media. But social media in terms of just, getting caught and going down a rabbit hole about different things or going on different social media and seeing how other people live and feeling really imposed upon by that because you can't go to the Caribbean and live at a fabulous resort. Those things are not very useful. The other thing that people often don't think of is what we psychologists call safety behavior around, and it's sort of a safety behavior is usually in a good thing, but in anxiety, it's not a good thing. It's the things that we do to keep us safe from the anxiety. So I only will do this after I've done this, or when I have this with me, or I need to have a drink before I deal with so-and-so. Or I can't go to a gathering without a friend. Now, it's a good thing to go to gatherings with friends, but if the only way that you can go is with a friend, then that's a safety behavior, and that impedes your confronting your anxiety and overcoming it. Or even something as simple as, I have to sit close to an exit, whenever I go to a concert. Well, why do I have to sit close to an exit? Oh, because I'm afraid of this and this and this. Well, then you shouldn't be sitting close to an exit. Or I need to have my mobile with me, my phone, or my rabbit's foot with me all the time. It's just my safety device, my good luck charm. So reducing safety behaviors is very important for overcoming anxiety. Changing what we think is also important. We have to begin to gradually change the story that we tell ourselves about situations from negative to more positive. So introducing parts of the story like, I'm a competent caregiver. It's a difficult situation, but I'm really quite good at this. Or I do my best. It's not perfect, but I do my best. Or somebody who's caring for a caregiver or not. My partner's difficult. I wonder how to get him to cooperate. So that's an acknowledgement that it isn't all your fault, but you have to do things to change the behavior. So what you say to yourself is very important. So sometimes we catastrophize. If we say things like, I can't cope, it's too much, I'm no good at this, caregiving is impossible, I can't keep this up, I don't have any support, my mother's so demanding, she's only going to get worse, I'm 45, I'm in debt, I'm alone and feel lost. People don't know how hard it is to be a caregiver. My partner's always complaining, I'm exhausted, I can't sleep, my body's falling apart, I cannot go on, I feel terrible, there's no future, everything is going wrong, I can't do anything right. I don't have enough saved for retirement. I can't stand being woken up every night. I don't know what to do. So if those thoughts are going through your head or something like that, you're catastrophizing. And catastrophizing is a style of thinking that we often get into with anxiety. And it's important to substitute more of a problem-solving style, of a positive style, acknowledging the difficulty of situations, but then going to say, okay, well, what can I do about it? All of these things aren't, everything isn't wrong. There are some good things. And what are they? So black and white thinking is very common in anxiety. It's either this way or it's this way. There's nothing in between. And, the problem with caregiving is there often are no simple solutions. And these complex situations require complex, multifaceted solutions. So instead of thinking, well, I can't deal with this because of this, because I can't deal with my mother who I'm caregiving because she's always whining, or I can't do this, or she's not always whining. She probably whines too much. And how can I deal with that? How can I help her stop whining so much? And then, of course, there's the terrible habit that many people have of perfectionism. And that's fueled by our culture, where it's, the expressions, well, if it's not worth doing perfectly, it's not worth doing at all. Well, that's simply not true. We can all do things a bit better. It's a good thing to strive to do things well, but none of us do things perfectly. Good emaugh is good enough. My father, bless his soul, we built a cottage together when I was just a kid, and he would try and do things well, but he wasn't a carpenter, and he had this expression, well, a blind man riding by at midnight on horseback probably wouldn't notice it. And so that was good enough. If the shingles were not quite straight, but they were good enough to keep the rain out. If if some of the nails weren't driven in perfectly straight, if there were a few marks on the lumber, although we used much of it was reclaimed lumber, but on lumber you missed the nail and you made a mark. Well, that's good enough. So problem solving is often the alternative to catastrophic thinking and negative thinking. And caregivers are, by their nature, good at problem solving. They're even better if they work together with more than one person, because oftentimes it does take more than one person to solve serious problems. So if it's an issue of future care and whether or not a person should be going into long-term care, it's not a good idea just to say, well, I'm going to be the only one to have to decide this. Well, maybe the decision is yours, but discussing these things with a lot of other people is often helpful. And don't try and search for a perfect solution. There is none. Small improvements in many situations are best. And if we can look for new ways or old ways of doing things that we've given up. Well, I used to have, cousin Mary come over, but, maybe cousin Mary isn't well enough to come over and sit with my mom. Well, but, her another cousin, yeah, Harry will come over. Maybe I can ask Harry. So we can also change the physiology. That's the way our body reacts naturally to a stressor. So as I mentioned before, that old sympathetic nervous system, we want to replace that with more parasympathetic responses. Meditation is very good. Yoga is excellent. Exercise is very good, even if it's only moderate or mild exercise. As the best expression I've ever heard in this area, the best exercise is the one that you will do. The best exercise is the one that you will do. That's very, very important. So walking around the block is better than sitting. Doing small exercises, lifting cans of beans is better than you don't have to have weights. You could lift cans of beans to strengthen your arms, to do some exercise in that way. And then deep, slow breathing. And that's probably the most direct way to trigger the parasympathetic nervous system. And what happens is you trigger the vagal nerve, and sometimes it's called vagal breathing. There's many different types of deep breathing, and some of them are, many of them are on the web. You can look at them. Sometimes people do, sessions of 4x4 breathing into the count of 4, breathing out. Sometimes they call it 4-7-4 breathing, or 4-6-4. Or there's no one way of doing it, but breathing slowly and deeply. And this is particularly good to do this for a few minutes when you're feeling that you're beginning to get wound up, beginning to get anxious. You just take a time aside. And at the same time, as you breathe slowly and deeply, you may say to yourself, okay, Pat, just calm down. Everything's going to be okay. Yep. Okay. Breathe deeply and slowly. I'll be okay. One of the phenomena that psychologists have found over the last 20, 30 years is that is called anxiety sensitivity. And that is the fear of being anxious. People with anxiety often begin to feel that they're afraid of the sensations of anxiety. Yeah, well, if my heart rate goes up, that means I'm going to, well, no, your heart rate goes up. It's okay. It might be uncomfortable, but it's not terrible. And what we do oftentimes for that is we have people purposely trigger sensations. They walk up the stairs very quickly, okay? And their heart rate will go up. So that's okay. Sometimes people are really afraid of being dizzy. So sit on one of those chairs that are swivel chairs if you can. Just spin around a bit. Or spin a bit, but make sure you don't fall down. That's, be careful. Or purposely do some fast, shallow breathing. Okay. And then the anxiety goes up and you learn to tolerate the anxiety. And again, practice is what's most important. And that's the way you get anywhere to change a behavior is you practice it, you practice it, you practice it. So what we do is of primary importance. changing the environment, and changing our own individual behavior. I'm going to stop there and answer questions. I do want to alert you to the 90-second health, which we put out, and the Ontario Caregivers Association members can subscribe to it. And it has all sorts of tips and ideas for caregiving. And I want to thank very much your attention. I think we have quite a bit of time now for questions and answers. I always like to leave time for questions and answers. And maybe this is the time to get up and stretch a little bit before the second half of the presentation. So thank you very much. And I'm glad to answer any questions. Or if you just want to make a comment, that's fine too.
So lots of activity in the chat box, some really wonderful and vulnerable and thoughtful questions that have come in. This is a topic that seems to really resonate with everyone that's joined today. And so I'm going to do my best to sort of summarize some of these questions. And one of the things that came out almost right away was this, the reality of caregiver burnout. So a lot of caregivers right now, and in the past, but now, are experiencing higher rates of burnout. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how does anxiety connect back to that? And if a caregiver is sort of in a place of burnout, what are some, initial steps that they can start taking to working their way slowly out of that burnout state?
Well, I think burnout is a way of expressing that the situation is so difficult, and my reactions are probably anxiety, depression, that sense of hopelessness, that there's nothing going to change. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the first step is to acknowledge the fact, I feel out of control. I feel I'm burned out. I feel like I can't do anything. Okay, so what can I do about that? What are the resources that I can? Well, I can't do anything. There's nothing I can do. No, Pat, just slow down that catastrophizing and now begin to think about, well, what can I do? Okay. One of the problems is that I just feel alone with this. So maybe I can seek out some friends, or the Ontario Caregiver has a peer help. Maybe I can get some help from that. Mm-hmm. Another situation is, I'm not eating well. I haven't been eating. I just don't feel like, like cooking. Well, maybe I have to have some very simple meals and make sure that I get my meals on time. I can't cope any longer with my husband asking the same questions all the time. Well, first of all, I got to step back from that and say, he does answer the same questions all the time, and it's naturally frustrating, but that's part of his disease, and I'm not going to be able to change that. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to have to smile, nod, say, yes, dear, I know. Yes, dear, I know. And not let it get under my skin. Try and stay away from letting it get under my skin. So that's an example, and everybody's going to be different, but small changes in many different ways is the way to if you're feeling that burnout, because the burnout means that you feel overwhelmed. It's anxiety, it's depression, and it's most of all this hopelessness. So you've got to put a little bit of control back into your environment and a little bit of control into your own reaction to the environment. Mm-hmm. I know that's simplistic, but it is, and it's hard to implement. It's not something that's easy to implement, because the situation of caregivers is just not recognized as caregiving is the backbone of our social service system, is the backbone of our health system. Without caregivers, it would fall apart totally. You'd have to have twice as many doctors, 3 times as many doctors, 4 times as many nurses, and many, many more hospitals and other institutions. So I think recognizing the work that you're doing is extremely valuable, but also recognizing that there are limits to what you do, and you have to put limits on what you do. And so you can't solve everything. You can't be everything to all, to the person you're caring for, or you just have to do your best. And sometimes it's not going to be, it's not going to be what you'd want to be able to do. So being a little bit more gentle with yourself is important. Yes, Katie.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. And it's a really great reminder that sometimes simple is the most effective, right? So we're humans. We're not superheroes, even though, well, we are, but we're still humans at the core of it. And so finding those things we can control and working towards that and leveraging the supports you have. There were lots of comments in the chat about, well, what if you don't have anyone else? And we know that caregiving is diverse, right? Sometimes folks have a big community around them, have family, friends, and professional services, but sometimes you're it, right? As a caregiver. And so you have to then look to Ontario Caregiver Organization or your local community resources to build those supports, to find those little things that can help dig you slowly out of burnout. So I think that's a really wonderful and helpful reminder. There's also been a lot of comments and questions around guilt. And we know that as a caregiver, oftentimes we feel guilty. We feel guilty about not being able to do enough, or we feel guilty about making that space and that time for ourselves, because maybe we should be doing something for the people we care for instead of something for ourselves, right? Guilty for not doing enough for the people that we love, or setting boundaries around the interaction and the exchange. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around how does anxiety play into guilt? And as we start to have those guilty moments, those thoughts that are creeping in, are there any tools or strategies to address that?
Yeah, so I think, guilt is something that often comes. We first learn to be guilty in our childhood. We did something wrong, so we are guilty, or we're raised in a culture that emphasizes duty and that we have to do it right. And some of that is really good. Okay, some of that is good. The person who feels a little bit guilty about doing something that they did wrong, that's fine. But when you get pervasive guilt, and in a situation like, for instance, that I'm not doing enough, I'm only working 14 hours a day, I'm only given up my career and totally rearranged the home so that I can care for my child or my partner or my parent. Well, then we have to step back and we say, okay, what would I say to somebody else if they were in this situation? You should feel guilty because you take 10 minutes off to go and have a coffee, or an hour to go and have lunch with somebody. No, you shouldn't feel guilty. That's what you would tell somebody else. That's often very helpful. But acknowledging the guilt, saying, yeah, I feel guilty, but this is probably unrealistic. This is probably not being compassionate to myself. I know I want to do the best for my husband or my wife, but I can only do what I can do. And I can only do so much, because if I keep going this way, I'm going to burn out. I'm not going to be able to take care of her. I need some sleep. So the way we talk to ourselves with a little bit of compassion, and also considering what would we say to somebody else in the same situation, I think is very important. I know that when I was caring for my wife, who died of ovarian cancer, and she was a marvelous person to take care of. I was very lucky that way. She was very grateful and helpful and so on. But at times I was just so tired, I could not think. And I could not stay by her side. I had to go somewhere where I could lie down and get some sleep. And, unfortunately, getting respite care I couldn't get it fast enough because her condition changed. And so, very quickly. And so it was really very, very difficult. And there was guilt. There was a feeling, well, I should be with her 24/7. I only have a short time with her. She needs me. But then I had to balance that and say, well, I'm not going to be any use to her if I become, incoherent because I haven't had any sleep, and I have to get my sleep. I have to be able to do something, and she's resourceful. She will manage. I'll make sure she's safe. But I can't be there 24/7. So I think you have to look at the situation, acknowledge the guilt, think of what other people you'd say to other people or what other people might say, and then consider that maybe they're being reasonable. Maybe it's more reasonable. And if you're going to be able to care for somebody else, you're going to have to take care of yourself as well. So the deep self-compassion is not selfishness. It's simply trying to do your best. And so it's really important to recognize that. But
That's
it's
so
not
important.
easy. It's
Yeah,
not easy.
it's none of this is easy, right? And
Right.
everybody's circumstances are so nuanced and specific to them. But I think that's a really helpful reminder that self-compassion is not selfishness. And we can easily, myself included, get caught in that thinking of if I take time for me, that's me being selfish, which then leads to me feeling guilty, to me investing everything I have in my person, to now I'm burnt out and resentful and hopeless. And, this cycle kind of
Right.
goes round and round and round.
And sometimes, it's okay to feel resentful. It's natural to feel resentful. As I said, my wife had cancer. It wasn't her fault, but sometimes I said to myself, damn it, why did you get cancer? Sort of stupid, but it was, those thoughts came to my mind. And as long as you acknowledge and say, yeah, okay, Pat, you need a little bit of sleep more. You need to do a little bit different things a little bit differently. Maybe I can draw, the respite care they promised me is not coming for a couple of weeks, but maybe I can get somebody just to sit with her for a period of time, and I'll go grab a nap, or I'll go for a walk, or I'll go to the coffee shop and chat with anybody at all, not about respite care, and I had an easier situation because I had enough money, and I also had enough. I had the support of we didn't have any family around, but I had support of some friends, and my wife was very easy to take care of.
Mhm. Yeah, I often say to caregivers, self-compassion is like the gas in the tank, right? So if we burn out, if our tank runs dry, our car's not going anywhere. And it's the same as
That's
us
right.
as humans, right? If we're not building in those moments of self-compassion, which leads to well-being and self-care and breaks and all the things that we're talking about, we don't have any fuel left to continue to give back. And so
Right.
but it's easier said than done.
It is.
And
And
there's a lot of comments coming through the chat about, I still struggle, like I know this, but I feel guilty, or I feel like I should be doing more, or my people get angry with them. So how do I set boundaries, right? And so there's some interesting questions about boundary setting, and
right.
then
And
which ties back to that guilt. Go
yeah.
ahead.
And so the thing is that we want to overcome guilt. You change what you're thinking, you change your behavior. Okay. You do some things that are self-compassionate, and you try and change your physiology. So don't let it get under your skin. Don't get really tense. Breathe deeply and slowly. Get some exercise. Try your meditation or yoga, or have a hot bath. Try and do those things to change the physiology. So the physiology, the thinking, and the behavior that you're doing, and try and change the environment if you can. Try and get some help in. Try and do something about the environment.
So thinking about setting boundaries. So we've got quite a few folks joining us today who have caregiving experiences where either they have folks in long-term care or in outside settings that aren't their homes, and they feel frustrated, or not frustrated, I don't want to put those words into their mouth, but they feel like they need to be visiting those people all the time, every day. I know I have, in my personal experience, I have this as an example where every free moment is in long-term care, and or for someone who feels like they need to always be on call ready for that next crisis to hit because they're dealing with a really challenging mental health condition or caregiving situation. How do we look at boundary setting in order to make that space for
Well,
self-compassion and all those things?
and the boundaries are going to shift. But there is one thing that you have to be clear is that you can't do everything. You will try and use your values to decide what's most important, and then you'll meet that need. But, for example, I mean, I have a brother in long-term care, and I'm the one that's been designated to deal with the long-term care facility when there's a challenge between him and the long-term care facility, which comes up, and it's hard. And we have him over for dinner, but he's not the only one that ever comes over for dinner and visits with us, because I have a wife and I have my values are that, yes, I want to take care of my family. Yes, I want to but I also have a wife. I also have a job. I also have, many, many, many different demands. And yes, I don't spend as much time visiting him as I should. And I always, when people say should, I say, well, you mean you'd like to? No, I should. That's the guilt coming back. And so changing the way I'm thinking about it and saying, I will do as best I can, but I have other obligations to myself, to my wife, to my job. I will have to meet them all. I can't meet them all perfectly. And sometimes people are going to be disappointed. That's too bad. I'll deal with it. I can't be perfect. I'm not perfect. On one of my slides, I mentioned that the Mennonites, I learned something from my wife's family, my wife who died, her family, and they were Mennonites, and the Oma told me that they always put a mistake in every quilt they make, because nobody is perfect. And it's presumptuous of us to think that we can be perfect. And so they always put a mistake in their quilt just to remind themselves that you can't be perfect. And I think that's really important, is to begin to think of it. Life is always a set of compromises. It's always a set of things that we do that are not exactly the way we would like, but we do our best. We do what is good enough.
Absolutely. We just got a comment from someone in the chat saying we can't make everyone happy. And I think
definitely not.
We can't, and we strive to as caregivers. That's why we are caregivers. But we're humans as well. And another comment, this webinar is amazing. So I'm so glad that folks are finding some tips. There's a ton of support happening in the chat box right now about finding resources and encouraging one another. And this is really why we do this. And hopefully people can take some of this knowledge. And again, for folks that are asking, the recording and all of the resources are going to be shared out with you so you can reflect back, because we know this is a lot of information kind of coming at you all at once. So I'm looking at the time and we have a couple minutes left before we have to wrap up for the day. But I wanted to acknowledge and ask on behalf of those 24/7 caregivers. There's a lot of folks that do get to go home or get breaks, or maybe they're doing distance caregiving, or their circumstances are different. But there are folks that are doing this 24/7, 7 days a week. And you've provided some really lovely tips and strategies at the top around nutrition, sleep hygiene, things along those lines. But sometimes sleep hygiene can be challenging for folks that are doing this around the clock. They have medical alarms going off. They have PSWs coming and going through the evenings. Or folks that are doing sort of mental health caregiving, they're always sort of at the ready. When am I going to get that call? What's going to happen? So for those that are doing this sort of seemingly forever, for 24/7, do you have any strategies to find those spaces for things like sleep hygiene or healthy nutrition, those mindfulness practices that you suggested?
Well, I think it's difficult. Okay, I think we have to acknowledge it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And it's if we think of small gains rather than trying to get large gains, small changes can make a big difference over time. So, for example, and each one is different. So, being on the ready all the time, being alert for that. Well, the problem is that you're not going to be able to react any better if you're on guard. So being hyper alert is something that is not always is not going to help you. Okay. So just realizing, well, I've always got to be aware because I can't, no, you're going to be able to react just as well if you're not super alert. Sometimes hyper alertness is due to a mental health problem, and caregivers, as you know, caregivers are prone actually to get PTSD. Okay, there's a high rate. We've done some studies on caregivers of children with neurodevelopmental disorders, and in one study we found 50% of them had PTSD. And there are good treatments for PTSD that are available. There are medical treatments that are pretty good. For instance, the antidepressant medication helps, but also the treatments that are given by psychologists and such are sometimes very effective, especially the exposure-based treatments. But these treatments are unfortunately not always available, and we're working to try and make them more available. But it is a challenge. But seeking out care for your own mental health is a good investment, because it's natural in a very difficult situation to develop a mental health problem. That's not because you're crazy, that's because you're human. And so after trauma, and caregivers get a lot of trauma, PTSD is not uncommon. Anxiety is not uncommon. So seeking out help from your family doctor or from a therapist can be very helpful. The 24/7 problem is also, you're going to be at times, you have to be somewhat what you would consider a little bit neglectful. Okay, I'm sorry, you just have to be, because otherwise you will die. You can't survive. You can't be alert 24/7. And so you need your sleep. And so that's going to be something that you're going to have to prioritize. So for you to be able to function, okay, you're going to have to do that. If you need more supports, OCO is very good at trying to get more supports for people. And but the challenge is, to be honest, is that society has not prioritized highly enough the work of caregivers. So I think that what we have to do is increase the priority for caregivers. The respite care, is a huge, huge problem. Respite care, and that very few people can afford to provide respite care on their own, and it's hard to find people. But we need to impress on our provincial governments in particular, because those are the people, and on our federal government. So we have to write a note, call your local MP, say that respite care, it should be a right, not something that is given in tiny doses for and you have to jump through dozens of hoops. But respite care is so important. So I'm sorry I go on about other things too, but I really think that these are difficult situations, but small changes and then system changes are important.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as we wrap up, before we did a webinar on PTSD and caregiving for folks that were asking. So that's available on our YouTube channel and on our website for folks that wanted to learn a little bit more about that. And for all the wonderful questions around how to access respite or home and community supports or peer support programming, anything for you as a caregiver, our helpline is available, and we'll be sending out that information in the post-webinar information as well. So I do want to thank you again, Dr. McGrath, for joining us during Mental Health Week and Caregiver Month. It's always a pleasure to have you here to gain a clearer understanding of the common mental health issues that caregivers face, and learning some really practical strategies to better support them in their role. So thank you for joining us today.
It's such a privilege to be here. Thank you.